Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Amita Bhide from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. This is a module on approaches and models of participation as a part of the paper on community organization. Participation has evolved in many different ways through the ages, and therefore there are so many experiments on participation that the approaches and models of community participation are varied. Each of these models has got its own relevance in community practice, and therefore we need to understand the relevance and the different aspects which each of these models gives us. Because of the variety of models that we have and so much of theory building around participation, I have chosen here to basically talk about 3 different approaches and models of participation, all of which are considered to be seminal in the field of community participation. One is that which has been developed by Arnstein, the other by Fraser, and a third by Cornwall. Arnstein in 1969, Arnstein, by the way, was an activist and an organizer who basically operated in cities of North America and who were trying to think about citizens largely in their relationship to the state. So she proposed a ladder of participation, which to date, I think most textbooks on participation would begin with Arnstein's ladder of participation. So this ladder of participation really looks at participation as citizen power in relation to a state and how it gets redistributed through different levels. Okay? At the lowermost rung is manipulation, and at the highermost rung of this is citizen control. So what is this manipulation? Manipulation in some way should not figure in the ladder of participation at all. But Arnstein includes this because it's a distortion of participation, often a ruse which is used by authorities as a public relations kind of mechanism, but which is an extremely tokenistic form of participation. Okay? So what happens? You form things like advisory committee, right? And this kind of advisory committee in fact is a manipulation. Or you will also see that sometimes there are forums like in the case of development plans of cities, there are citizens consultations which are taken. Or in case of environmental impact assessments today in India, it is compulsory to have a public hearing. But as one environmental minister recently declared that we often have public hearings where sometimes you have the public but there is no hearing, and sometimes we have the hearing but there is no public. Okay? With these kind of tokenistic forms, this is what manipulation is. And real purpose of these kind of things often is really engineering social support for projects which authorities want to initiate. The second rung of this ladder is therapy. Okay? And therapy perhaps is even more dishonest than manipulation, because here real intentions are distinct and which are never ever revealed to the participants in the who are becoming or getting involved with a particular project. A classic example of this is the slum adoption scheme. The slum adoption scheme by the Municipal Corporation of Mumbai states that its object is basically to involve slum residents in solving their sanitation issues in a participatory manner. What it is, in fact, is one way by which the municipal corporation does not want to extend its regular services to the slum residents, instead is appointing low-paid contractors and volunteers in order to get that job done. In short, it's something where manipulation is happening, but it is being couched in a form of participation. The third rung perhaps is one of the ones where some genuine participation actually starts. And this is the rung of informing. What this means is that authorities or state bodies begin to talk to citizens and tell them in a one-way fashion about what are the things that they are going to do. Okay? And this perhaps we can take examples of when large-scale land acquisition projects are taken up. State authorities do put up notices and inform citizens about what is going to happen. The fourth rung is where some kind of delegation, some kind of a two-way dialogue begins to happen. And this is a stage of consultation. Consultation takes place when officials invite opinions of citizens. So you're moving one step ahead than information. Okay? So there are different forms that this kind of participation can take. Sometimes you do opinion surveys. There are neighborhood meetings which are undertaken. Public hearings are undertaken. Sometimes they can run the risk of being tokenistic, but sometimes they can also be very, very genuine. And therefore, one is moved one rung higher in the form of a two-way kind of a thing. Placation. When citizens are organized, okay, or if you begin to see that the stakes in the project are very, very high, then citizens have more say in the project. And therefore, then what authorities resort to is what is called placation. A classic example of this is perhaps you have the entire experience of Delhi, where the Delhi High Court at one stage took a decision that all establishments which were in contravention of use which had been determined in the master plan of Delhi had to be demolished. Okay? And this meant then that there was a huge outcry against this when the Delhi government actually began taking action against this. So traders organized themselves, all residents organized themselves, and after this then the Delhi government was compelled to come up with a decision to have a mixed land use, which was much more accepting of how citizens actually lived and worked. Okay. Now this is a very, very interesting kind of a proposition. You can have many more examples of this form of placation, which has moved from only asking opinions of citizens to perhaps giving in a little to what they are also asking for. The next rung, we are now moving to a higher level of dialogue, is the stage of partnership. And where partnership is where power is actually begin to be redistributed. So there is a negotiation between the power holders and the citizens. There are several examples of partnership where there are projects which are which kind of celebrate participation. So I'll give you the instance of a water project where decisions such as where to put in taps, what kind of water scheme should be there, what are adequate water sources, the contribution, how it should be decided, all of these get decided through a partnership between the authorities and the local villagers. Now these are instances where now one has started moving higher in the overall rung of participation, and where power has actually begun to be redistributed. You don't see all the reins which are being actually held by the state authorities themselves, and citizens begin to be more and more powerful in relation to the overall process. Now in delegated power, this perhaps is even more interesting than partnership, because partnership, you don't define all the realms of decision making. Okay, delegated power, there are particular decisions which are completely left to citizens. Okay. We had a very interesting scheme in Africa in the initial stages of community development, where local villagers were to actually suggest projects for development, and the government would come in with the technical expertise and the funds for those development. To me, this is a very interesting form of delegating power. But contrarily and perhaps expectedly, one finds that the spaces for this kind of delegated power are very, very limited. Okay, and often they also tend to be very exploited by people who are thirsty for power. So they are very abused kind of spaces. The highest rung of this ladder of participation is really the level of citizen control. This citizen control is actually representing a level where citizens have a control over several processes of decision making, moving from where, what kind of projects, to implementation, to evaluation of projects. And sometimes this can also take the form where citizens and the state become co-producers and co-designers of development. So in short, if you look at Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation, this is something which is very much in the contemporary real world, where the state and state institutions are very important, where a whole lot of powers have been taken away from communities and vested in the state. And what are the different forms that actually relationships of citizens with the state can take, and how to become more participatory. We will now shift to another very, very interesting model of participation, something which is much more, I would say, relevant to the overall nation of community practice and community organization. And here, this is the approach which has been used by Heather Fraser. Heather Fraser, she basically builds her entire work on the work of several others, like If, Young, White, and what she sees is that there are 4 approaches to participation. These 4 approaches to participation are really based on 2 primary distinguishing factors. One is, how do you conceptualize community, and how do you conceptualize change? And further, the idea of approaches is also that there is a continuum of participatory practice. Okay. She also tells us that instead of Sherry Arnstein, who looks at state and citizens who are almost locked into like a adversarial relation kind of thing, Heather Fraser looks at a state in society perspective, which means that the state is not something which can be devoid of the dynamics and the structures of society itself. It also reflects the same, and therefore also that there are multiple organizations which engage with participation. It is not just state institutions which deal with the idea of participation. So Heather Fraser's model and I would say approaches to participation have much more relevance for community practice per se, because community practice can not just happen from state initiative, it can also happen from multiple other initiatives which are possible, sometimes civil society, sometimes trade unions, sometimes self-help, and so on and so forth. So looking at this chart of how Heather Fraser looks at and approaches participation, she basically divides notions of participation or approaches to participation into 4. There are reluctant communitarians, there are technical functionalist communitarians, there are progressive communitarians, and there are radical communitarians. So reluctant communitarians, basically their notion of community is one which is extremely mythical, okay, highly sentimental, and you often look at community as a notion where people contribute of their own. They are either consumers or they are unpaid. So they don't look at market-based transactions. Community is something which is soft. Community is a notion of where people relate to each other on tangible and intangible means out of just a sense of social capital. That's a reluctant kind of a communitarian. And therefore, these reluctant communitarians, therefore, should they use the notion of participation? They relegate any kind of notion of community and community participation to the softer dimension. So they believe that the state should do only the minimum. And therefore, why do you engage with the community? You engage with the community so that you want to prevent trouble. You have to maintain good public relations, that there are opportunities for profit that can be undertaken, and hence an engagement with participation. So you engage with that notion, but really you are not very interested in the community. You think it is really mythical, does not live in the real world. The technical functionalist communitarians, again a very interesting kind of a approach to participation. Who are they? Now here are very pragmatist, utilitarian kind of people, and who believe that why should you bring in community? Because then you can move to the optimal solution. Okay? And what are communities therefore? Communities, they see communities as stable, as extremely homogeneous, okay? And they are connected collectivities. This is a social capital. And therefore, if you use this social capital, you can save on time, you can be more efficient, you can make decisions without trouble. For example, a water department engaging with villagers, because the villagers will be able to say then what are the best water resources, which are not there within the knowledge of the water resources department. It can therefore increase the efficiency of a water service project. It can also create less trouble and therefore be more efficient. Okay? And this therefore is the technical functionalist kind of communitarian. The third kind of communitarians which Fraser talks about are the progressive communitarians. Now progressive communitarians are actually animated with a whole lot of ideas which are now imagining also the political possibilities in a community, and therefore they begin to look at mobilized collectives who have shared resources. They can address issues of social and environmental justice. They look at it in terms of transcending national boundaries also. So basically then, who is the community? Why should you? Because then it becomes, community participation becomes a voice and an agency for those who actually face issues. Okay? Those who are at the receiving end of exploitation, and therefore the process of forming the collective is itself something which is participatory. The radical communitarians are those who basically look at individualism as a basic problem, and therefore they would like to see that there is a radical change across different borders, from local borders to perhaps global borders as well. They see that individualism is a site really of oppression, and therefore you need to launch that struggle also at that level of the community itself. So community participation becomes one way in which the exploitation by the self, the exploitation of the self through ideas of traditionalism, etc., is linked to global struggles for emancipation. Now, obviously, in all of these different approaches to participation, the forms of participation also vary. So, if reluctant communitarians look at participation largely in terms of task-focused processes, So they will try to form committees. So it is a very, very minimalistic kind of idea of participation. So they will form committees, or they will form a task force, uh, or subcommittees for that matter, etc. And or there is a short public relation exercise or a consultation with which you are already convinced that decisions are already taken, and you want to minimally only communicate to people. And therefore it is largely about, or you have a community practice where everything is left to the community and there is very little role of the state. So they would look at an outcome where basically there is self-regulation, or there are good business models which are emerging. The technical functionalist communitarians, for them forms of participation have to be apolitical. The role of the expert is very, very important. And then you try to evolve forms which are very, very protocolized. So there are forms through which you have participation, you form forums, only there you can deliberate, or you outsource something to the communities because you want to complete and be efficient, you want to save on costs, and that so mobilizing and deploying that social capital is the key idea of participation here. In the case of progressive communitarians who look at participation as a highly political thing, for them face-to-face meetings as well as technological connects are very important. They would see protests as a form of participation itself, and therefore for the, in terms of outcome, it is how do you relate to authorities. So if you begin to look at Sherry Arnstein's models, Sherry Arnstein's ladder fits in very well with this progressive communitarian kind of a approach to participation. We now move to the final model in participation, and which is an approach which has been given by Andrea Cornwall. Andrea Cornwall creates two basic classifications of spaces of participation, and understand that this notion of spaces of participation is a very, very important notion. Okay? Where, what are the sites of participation? You have Sherry Arnstein who has talked of कि it is happening in relation to the state and citizens. You have Fraser who is talking of the approach. What are those actually sites? What is their character? And what Cornwall talks about is basically that when it comes to the practice of participation, there are spaces which become important. And she talks of two different spaces. One is what are called invited spaces. Invited spaces are owned by agencies which are the protagonists of participation. On the other hand, there are claimed spaces, and claimed spaces are spaces which are created by people for participation. Okay. Now, why are invited spaces important? Invited spaces are important because these are spaces which are created by government agencies, by state agencies. So these may fund development projects, or these may be even non-governmental agencies, but who want to involve people in the implementation of projects. And therefore invited spaces are important. One cannot undermine them, especially in the current kind of context of where a lot of development seems to come and proposed by actually top-down kind of models. Now in these kind of invited spaces, one will really see that what is the nature of participation, what is its content, how do you design. All of this is contingent then upon the approaches that we have discussed earlier, both by Sherry Arnstein as well as by Fraser. But I think one thing to remember here is that often what may be a assigned value of participation in the beginning is not actually often the way in which participation is realized. And in my experience, you will also see that often proponents of participatory projects will try to control participation. They would like to see participation like a tap, which can be turned off or which can be opened as you please. But often the strength of people processes is such that the tap refuses to close, that the tap assumes a life of its own. And this is where I think we need to move to the second concept, which is complementary to invited spaces and which is that of claimed spaces. So what is this trajectory of claimed spaces? Claimed spaces are spaces which are taken up by people who are wanting to participate. Now in these cases, one basically sees that groups which claim spaces are much more homogeneous. So in the first case, participation is proposed by some outside agencies and therefore it is very diverse, whereas participation which is invited tends to be more homogeneous and which is much less diverse. There are also less hierarchies, but at the same time it may not be representative of a broader society. So these kind of invited spaces and participation which happens through that, it tends to be formed around very shared interests and own resources. These are spaces and these are mobilizations which are very spontaneous, which often tend to be much more enduring. Just to give an example, there was a plan and a campaign around the Mumbai development plan which was formed in Mumbai in 2014, and today even after the development plan is nearly finalized, that campaign is staying on and people continue to connect with each other. This is because the people, when they organize, there is much more emotional and social involvement. So this is not limited then to the public spaces of participation which are created by the invited spaces. So in some sense, inventing new spaces also is necessary, because these kind of new spaces then engage the different forces which are either facilitating people or they are constraining people's aspirations for development. So in order to also sum up, I think what one sees is that this division between invited spaces and claimed spaces is something that we need to understand goes beyond the ideological and the conceptual kind of boundaries which earlier models have placed upon participation. So for example, for Sherry Arnstein, you assign one value to participation and that's the way it stays, okay? Or either Fraser, who talks about the reluctant communitarians or the radical communitarians, and so the way it is conceptualized is the way it is practiced. But I think what Andrea Cornwall brings to us is that the practice of participation is actually much more dynamic, and therefore one needs to look at the overall nature of these spaces themselves. In order to conclude, I think what does the study of these approaches to participation actually give us? And it is important to reflect on each of these. Okay? What you realize is that participation as a strategy is used in multiple contexts, very, very varied, and therefore community practitioners need to be aware of in what context to use what kind of methodology. Suppose the kind of organization, the kind of practice context that you have is that of a reluctant communitarian. What kind of strategies would you use? What kind of dynamics would you kind of encounter? And then you need to first also realize then, therefore, what are the values that you attribute to participation? Moving ahead from there, I think one of the realizations which is also very necessary is to realize that participation is a very, very dynamic process. And beyond all of these models and approaches, it is something, the minute people are involved, it necessarily cannot be controlled. You can attempt to control it, you can attempt to shape it, but at the same time, invited spaces also intersect and interact with claimed spaces. So you can see that participation, how it is initiated and how it may end up maybe two different spaces altogether. The final thing that I would say is basically that participation requires, if you are really committed to the idea of participation, it requires a very sensitive creation of spaces. And this sensitive creation of spaces which are in sync with the way people live, with the kind of needs that people have. And once you create those spaces, then the rest is something that people themselves can lead and take forward. You need not be overly controlling of that. So professionals in participation need to be much more cognizant of how do you create those spaces and facilitate those initial processes. For references, of course, you should refer Fraser, Cornwall, and Shirley Arnstein. Thank you.